I also had the same class as Katie, so this is another paper for Dr. DiBiase. I'm a big nerd, so my paper was basically geeking out about two of my favorite things, which is Shakespeare and Wales. So without any further ado, this is Who Are the Britons? Shakespeare and the Welsh. One of the almost quoted to the point of absurdity lines from Shakespeare is his "all the world's a stage" quote from As You Like It. And Shakespeare seems to live by this himself. He is well known for bringing a lot of countries to the stage in England. And his multinational plays offer enticing glimpses into how Shakespeare and the Londoners that he wrote for and who viewed his plays, how they looked at the world around them. Wales is one such country alluded to by Shakespeare, and while he never really discusses it to the same extent he does other nations like Italy, there are hints throughout his plays that provide a key as to how Shakespeare and the people he wrote for viewed their small western neighbor. Can't really talk about Wales without also referring to Wales and England and their history. In Monty Python's famous film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, King Arthur approaches and queries a saucy and rather obdurate peasant, and then, angered by the peasant's attitude towards him, King Arthur proudly proclaims, "I am Arthur, King of the Britons." The peasant is rather unruffled and simply responds by asking Arthur, "Who are the Britons?" Played for laughs by Monty Python, this scene is a saddeningly accurate summation of modern society's lack of understanding when it comes to Anglo-Welsh history and relations. A large part of the confusion is buried in the misappropriation of the term British. Historically, British, or Britons, referred to the ethnically Celtic tribes inhabiting the island the Romans called Britannia. After the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons, from whence the name England comes, Angloland, England, they arrived and drove the Celtic tribes into the region now known as Wales to the west. And gradually, the term British was also applied to the Anglo-Saxons in addition to the Welsh, as they were now the inhabitants of the island Britannia, though they had no real ethnic tribes or cultural ties to the original British. Thus, a natural rivalry, contempt, a lot of hatred of each other sprung up between the two nations, one the conqueror and thief, the other the conquered and victim. By the time of Elizabeth's reign in the 16th century, Wales was definitely considered the lesser of the two nations. Much like the bears in the infamous bear baiting pits, the Welsh were treated as the laughing stock. They were considered animals that still had some bite to them. Nowhere was this treatment of the Welsh more evident than on the playhouse stage. The Welsh language, for example, and other Celtic languages such as Irish and Scottish, were considered foul and savage tongues, and their lines in their native tongue were intentionally altered to make them sound like English words for body parts. Even well-known and respected playwrights like George Peele or Christopher Marlowe indulged in creating a mockery of the Welsh character. Most of their Welsh characters are personified as being crooks and Hitler-like ruthless killers. Shakespeare doesn't have a lot of Welsh characters, and they're mostly minor roles, actually. So his opinion is somewhat cloaked, but by delving into his plays and kind of peeling back the layers, you can come to a better understanding of his thoughts and feelings on this issue. Shakespeare's representation of Wales is actually very multifaceted and complicated, and while his views are ultimately staunchly English and empirical, he does treat the Welsh with a then unprecedented level of respect and actually sympathy. Shakespeare goes to great lengths to vary the depiction of the Welsh characters in his plays, and in so doing avoids feeding into any form of racial stereotyping like Christopher Marlowe and George Peele did. Shakespearean Welshmen rise above the brutality of popular conception to demonstrate a depth and complexity of character that was hitherto unheard of for a Welshman on the Elizabethan stage. Shakespeare breathes into his characters a real sense of thought and being, and inextricably links that humanity, a basic consideration they were usually otherwise denied. Henry IV, Part 1, is the first major Shakespearean work in which he takes on the subject of Wales. And most interestingly, the impression the audience gets of the Welsh at the onset is not really favorable. In the opening scene, one of the characters, one of Henry's noblemen in Westmoreland, comes in and gives an account of an altercation between English and Welsh armies on the border. And Shakespeare's account that he gives to Westmoreland is somewhat vague, but his source, which we all know, Holinshed's Chronicles, divulges the full account. The dead bodies of the Englishmen, being about 1,000 lying upon the ground, imbrued in their own blood, was a sight, a man would think, grievous to look upon, and so far from exciting and stirring up affections of cruelty, that it should rather have moved the beholders to commiseration and mercy. Yet did the women of Wales cut off their privities, and put one part thereof in the mouths of every dead man, in such sort that the cullions, or testicles is the modern English word, hung down to their chins, and not so contented, they did cut off their noses and thrust them into their tails, as they lay on the ground mangled and defaced. Even Shakespeare's restrained reference to this event would have reminded Englishmen of this ever-present threat of a Welsh uprising. The play takes the bodily debasement and threat of English castration and turns it into a social and political commentary. First, by stuffing the mouths of their foes, the Welsh mock any endeavor by the English to supplant their native tongue and replace it with a foreign one. Secondly, the cutting up and rearranging of body parts is a crude gesture of control and power, signifying that the Welsh are no longer subject to England. Lastly, by inserting their victim noses into their private parts in an act of self-sodomy, the Welsh women upset English masculinity and removed their claim to manhood, effectually calling England weak and effeminate. Shakespeare introduces the audience to Henry IV, Part 1, by playing into the pre-created stereotypes of the dangerous and barbaric Celts, and most playwrights would have left the play there, with the unidimensional Welsh as brutes and a danger to the English state. Shakespeare, however, does rise above his peers and instead goes on to create a Welsh character that is also noble and heroic. At the opening of the play, Glendower, the leader of the Welsh forces, is seen from a traditional English viewpoint as a quintessential, untamable savage. But Shakespeare then turns that preconception on its head and creates a deeply nuanced and sympathetic character. Glendower acts out the roles of a mighty warrior, gracious lord, and loving father in such an appealing way that even the staunchest Englishman must admit him a gentleman. The English, both characters and audience alike, grow to appreciate and respect him, not as a figure, but as a man. The final judgment of the English, by the English of the Welshman is that, in faith, he's a worthy gentleman, exceedingly well-read, valiant as a lion, and wondrous affable. The next major play Shakespeare dealt with the Welsh in was Henry V, the sequel to Henry IV, dealing with Henry IV's son, also named Henry. English have like two names. Shakespeare's initial view of the Welsh is and Henry IV, Shakespeare's initial view of the Welsh is broadly political in its antipathy and vitriolic tendency, but he subtly works underneath and undermines the audience impression with the humaneness of the noble Glendower. And Henry V, Shakespeare kind of works in the opposite way. His attitude towards the Welsh is seemingly pleasant, but turbulent political analysis roils beneath the surface. According to Frederick J. Harries, the Welsh captain Llewellyn is the most prominent secondary character and was meant to be favored by the English audiences as a brave and honorable soldier that actually stood up to English expectations of what manhood was. Despite this, there is a persistent distinction made that Llewellyn is Welsh, and therefore an alien being, something distinctly un-English. So Shakespeare subtly introduces a factious political landscape where instead of possessing a unified and cohesive front, King Henry's forces are split by national interests. Firstly, Llewellyn's marked Welsh accent, in particular his substitution of P's for B, is noticed by other characters and fundamentally isolates him from the English characters. Then there is the matter of Llewellyn's infamous leek. The most prominent scene with the leek is on the occasion where Llewellyn forces the blustering pistol and Englishmen to eat the leek. An ominous scene for English audiences, the imposition of a Welsh leek onto an English citizen would evoke this persistent fear of a Welsh invasion of England. At a time where England was deeply focused on the affairs of France and the European continent, her rear border was left increasingly vulnerable. The league that Pistol is compelled to ingest is not just a symbol of Welsh nationalism, but it can also be viewed as a phallic icon. Llewellyn's imposing of the league into Pistol's mouth in a rape-like manner imparts the threat of Wales forcing itself on England's unprotected rear and breaching English stability. The last of Shakespeare's plays to deal with Wales in any significant way is Cymbeline, which, if you guys have read the play, you know there are actually no Welsh characters in this. The closest Shakespeare gets are Belarius and his two sons, Polydor and Cadwell, though if you've read the play at the end, you know they're revealed to not be Welsh, they're actually English. Because of this dearth of Welsh characters, Shakespeare's attitude towards the nation as a whole is reflected much more strongly, making it more blatantly political than his previous works, where any political significance was muted by the personalness of the individual Welsh character. Wales' position as a nation fuels the political aspect of the play. At the time of the play's setting in ancient Roman Britain, Britain would have been a cohesive whole inhabited by one people group, the Britons. However, Shakespeare works anachronistically and treats Wales as a separate and distinct country. This sentiment is repeated a few times throughout the play, most memorably when Imogen learns that Posthumus is at Milford Haven and inquires, "How is Wales made so happy as to inherit such a haven?" And then possibly more telling is when Cymbeline orders a safe conduct for Lucius, the Roman ambassador, till he has crossed it's a Welsh word, it's hard to pronounce, Severn, which is the traditional border of Wales. And this applies to a modern audience who's aware of that what lays behind the Severn is out of Cymbeline's control and therefore out of English control. When he distinguishes Wales as an autonomous state, Shakespeare is forced to take on the age-old dispute of who is really British, the Welsh or the English. Cymbeline is also one of the more imperialistic of Shakespeare's works. Shakespeare wrote Cymbeline approximately 8 years after James I of England, born a Scotsman, had taken the throne, so the underlying themes of assimilation tie in greatly to the political atmosphere of the day. As the British characters venture out into the Welsh mountainside, it becomes a tale of civilized man reaching out into the wild and taming its inhabitants. Imogen's interactions with Belarius and his sons take on the form of England reaching out to the lesser Wales and offering it the proverbial hand up. Robert Bowling claims, Imogen is like a Miranda to a cave full of Calibans, but with sexual tension meticulously excised. Miranda teaches Caliban to read, so Imogen carves roots into characters in her attempt to teach the outlaws to read. Caliban must be civilized, and in the same manner, Wales and its inhabitants must be tamed and brought into civilized society. Determining Shakespeare's view towards the Welsh is a complicated task. He certainly treats his Welsh characters with more respect than his contemporaries, but they are never represented as animals or as persons of ridicule, but are treated with respect and made to be likable and relatable. He also demonstrates a broad knowledge of Welsh culture, an indication that he had enough regard for Welsh culture to put some research into his representation of his people. However, Shakespeare is by no means a champion of the Welsh, and popular sentiment does permeate into his portraiture of the Welsh character. English fear of a Welsh uprising and invasion underlie both Henry IV Part I and Henry V, and then in Cymbeline, Wales does not pose the violent threat that it does in the previous two plays, but it is the object of English imperialistic expansion. Throughout his works, Shakespeare acknowledges Wales' cultural independence, but recognizes that Wales will ultimately be subjugated to England, and that political unification is an unavoidable destiny.